Today, we're jumping into one of the most incredible military campaigns you'll find anywhere in the ancient world, King David's unbelievable winning streak. We're going to use the text of 2 Samuel as our guide to figure out how a pretty minor ruler suddenly took down 5 enemy nations one right after the other. So let's break down the playbook that made it all happen. First off, here's a little bit of context that might actually surprise you. When we hear the word king, we picture this all-powerful monarch on a massive throne. But the original Hebrew word, melech, was way broader. Sure, it could mean a great emperor, but it could also mean the ruler of just one city, kind of like a local mayor or governor. And that little detail, it's absolutely key to understanding where our story begins. So when David first came onto the scene, his whole situation was, well, shaky, to say the least. He wasn't the powerful king we think of. He was just one Melech trying to hold his own against a bunch of rivals. And as you're about to see, his sudden climb to the top was not going to go unnoticed. In fact, it was about to trigger a huge, violent backlash. And this really shows you the dramatic power shift. At first, David was just the king of his own tribe, Judah. For the regional superpower, the Philistines, he was basically a convenient local governor, someone they could easily control. But then, David unites all the tribes of Israel, and the game completely changes. He wasn't some pawn anymore, he was a rival king with a huge territory, and that put a giant target on his back. This brand new threat forced David to show a side of himself that really sets his story apart from a lot of other ancient accounts of war. It turns out David was a brilliant military strategist. So how did wars typically play out back then? You might be thinking of epic movie battles, but the reality was often a lot simpler. Most of the time, it really just came down to brute force. Who had the bigger army? Who had better weapons? Sometimes, these ancient stories talk about direct divine intervention, like a freak storm or a plague that wipes out an entire army. But what you almost never see described in a lot of detail is clever, complex military strategy. And this is where David just flips the script. His victories weren't just about having more soldiers or getting lucky, they were often the result of pure tactical genius. He actually outthought his enemies. Okay, let's look at a classic example from one of his fights with the Philistines. Instead of just charging head-on, David has his men hide in a mulberry grove. Then he tells them to wait for this really specific signal, the sound of marching in the treetops. The second they hear it, they launch this devastating surprise attack, and the enemy completely falls apart. This wasn't just fighting. This was a masterclass in timing and psychological warfare. So, with his throne now secure and his tactical mind totally sharpened, David unleashes this absolutely stunning series of conquests that would reshape the entire region, one enemy at a time. First up, he goes after Israel's oldest and most powerful enemy, the Philistines. And he doesn't just defeat them, he pushes deep into their turf and captures Gath. Now, this wasn't just any city. It was the hometown of Goliath. Capturing it sent a huge message to everyone in the region. Next, he turns his army east to the Moabites. The result was just as decisive. They weren't just beaten on the battlefield, their whole nation was forced into what's called vassalage. Basically, they became subjects of David's kingdom, forced to pay him tribute. And the source text includes this really grim, shocking detail about this campaign. To show his total dominance, David had the Moabite prisoners of war line up. He then executed 2 out of every 3 of them. I mean, what a brutal message. Resistance will be crushed without mercy. At this point, the momentum was just unstoppable. So when the northern kingdoms of Zobah and Aram decided to team up against him, David's forces crushed their combined armies. They too were folded into his empire and forced to pay tribute, pushing his influence further than ever. And finally, he marches south against the Edomites. In a single massive battle in the Valley of Salt, David's army apparently killed 18,000 soldiers and brought their entire nation under his control. In a shockingly short amount of time, the impossible winning streak was complete. So, you just have to stop and ask, right? How did this happen? How did this minor king, who just a few years earlier was literally a fugitive on the run, manage to defeat 5 established nations in a row? Well, the source text itself doesn't actually credit David's military genius or the strength of his army as the ultimate reason. It points to something else entirely. This is the key phrase, and it's repeated twice in the chapter. The narrative's explanation is actually super straightforward. David won because God was with him. So, the crucial point, according to the text, is that all of David's success came from this divine partnership. And this comparison just brilliantly illustrates the main message. The author wants us to remember that this same mighty king who conquered 5 nations was once a desperate fugitive hiding in enemy territory who even pretended to be insane just to stay alive. The contrast couldn't be more stark. His strength wasn't something he was born with. The text presents it as something that he was given. Now, the sermon that serves as our source material for this analysis, it doesn't just leave this story in the ancient world. It actually draws a direct line from David's battles to the kinds of struggles that people face today. So the sermon presents these ancient enemies as metaphors. The Philistines, that constant, overwhelming force, are compared to crushing financial problems. The Moabites, that persistent thorn in the side, are likened to bad habits or personal failings we just can't seem to shake. And the Aramaeans, a sudden invasion from far away, are framed as something like an unexpected illness or a family crisis. So what's the big takeaway? Well, the sermon argues that victory in these modern struggles, just like David's ancient ones, doesn't really depend on our own strength or our resources. The decisive factor is this belief in a divine partnership. And that phrase, wherever you go, is presented as this incredible source of comfort, whether you're at your job, in a hospital room, or just at home. And this is the final, powerful message the source material leaves us with. It reframes that ancient biblical promise into a very personal statement of encouragement. It's a reminder that no matter what enemy you're facing or what battlefield you're on, the same source of strength that powered David's impossible winning streak is presented as being available today. So what do you think that means for the challenges we face in our own lives?